Today, we are asking a profound question. Did China truly win the Korean War as they claimed? The war was devastating. Wave after wave of Chinese soldiers charged American positions, only to be cut down by overwhelming firepower. In the unforgiving -40 degrees Celsius winter, countless others froze to death, with entire divisions disappearing into the cold. But the true cost went far beyond the battlefield. What lasting price did ordinary Chinese pay for the so-called Great Victory proclaimed by the Communist Party? Was it really a triumph or a tragedy too costly to justify? Stay with us as we uncover the hidden truths of the Korean War from China's perspective, stories that remain unheard by many. On October 25, 1950, South Korean forces first encountered Chinese troops. Just days later, the Chinese engaged the US Army, finally revealing their presence to General MacArthur. But MacArthur remained confident, believing the Chinese force to be no more than 30,000 soldiers. How could a larger, heavily armored force evade constant US air surveillance? What he didn't realize was that over 200,000 Chinese troops had already crossed into Korea. Within weeks, the US Army found itself joined to the Chosin Reservoir, precisely where the Chinese wanted them. Mao Zedong was thrilled, convinced the soft playboys of America would retreat at the first sign of a real fight. He seemed to forget, though, that just 5 years earlier, the same American forces were called soft by the Japanese at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, with devastating consequences. On November 7th, Mao sent an ambitious message to his commanders. We aim to destroy 7 or 8 enemy regiments in a month and push the front line to the Pyongyang-Wonsan Railway. If successful, we will achieve a decisive victory. At this moment, Mao's confidence exceeded that even of General MacArthur, who led the strongest military in the world. This overconfidence led Mao to dispatch the Ninth Corps into Korea as quickly as possible, setting the stage for one of the most tragic and grueling battles of the Korean War, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. Most of the Ninth Corps would never return, lost to the unforgiving winter of 1950. Just a few months before, in the early autumn of 1950, Mao ordered the Ninth Corps, stationed in the warm Fujian province and originally prepared for an invasion of Taiwan, to redeploy near the China-Korea border. But there was a big problem: the weather. The difference in climate was massive, and the commanders quickly requested winter gear for the troops. Mao ignored the request. On October 12th, Mao, growing impatient, demanded immediate deployment. Again, his generals urged him to delay until winter supplies arrived, but he refused. Over the next 2 weeks, he issued repeated orders for deployment. In the rush to war, things like winter clothing seemed like trivial details to him. He had bigger dreams to fulfill. The Ninth Corps, nearly 150,000 strong, boarded the trains and headed north. Their mission was to encircle and destroy the advancing Americans. By late October, the weather was already getting cold when soldiers arrived near the border. Under Mao's orders, they left their heavy weapons behind, armed with only 80 bullets each, with neither tanks, air support, nor anti-aircraft defenses. They marched through North Korea's rough, mountainous terrain under the cover of darkness. General MacArthur believed that for China to fight the US Army, they would need heavy equipment and vast supplies, making it impossible for them to hide from American air patrols. No one imagined that any rational commander would send hundreds of thousands of ill-equipped troops into battle against the US military, especially in such brutal winter conditions. But MacArthur was wrong. Mao didn't think like other commanders. Just as both sides expected, American air forces dominated the skies, the sea, and the land. The 30,000 US and UN troops stationed at the Chosin Reservoir were backed by 5 aircraft carriers and massive land artillery support. Mao had envisioned a swift and decisive victory, hoping to wipe out several US divisions. but quickly learned that destroying even a single American battalion was difficult. Wave after wave of Chinese soldiers charged forward, only to be met by a relentless barrage of American artillery and napalm. After each assault, the battlefield was littered with countless bodies. To American generals, it appeared as though Chinese commanders saw their soldiers' lives as expendable. Their high tolerance for casualties left the Americans in horror. Despite the overwhelming firepower, the sheer number of Chinese soldiers proved unstoppable. The Americans soon found themselves completely surrounded. To make matters worse, the brutal winter conditions only added to their struggle, forcing them to fight their way out of the encirclement in a desperate bid for survival. In comparison, the extreme cold made the Chinese suffer the most. Within just weeks of entering Korea, the Chinese army had already lost at least 30% of its men. During the battle, both American and Chinese records describe entire companies of Chinese soldiers freezing to death. In one chilling incident, retreating American Marines stumbled upon a group of Chinese soldiers, but there was no gunfire. On closer inspection, the entire company had frozen solid while lying in ambush. It was a song of ice and fire. After weeks of brutal fighting, Chinese divisions like the 58th and 60th were reduced to just a few hundred men, less than 5% of their original strength just 1 month before. They couldn't stop the American retreat anymore. By December 11th, all American troops and over 100,000 Korean refugees had successfully retreated from the port of Hangnam, marking the end of the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. Nearly 80% of the 80,000 Chinese soldiers sent into battle were lost. The Ninth Corps was effectively wiped out. For the Americans, it was survival rather than victory, despite their enemies' far higher casualties. But for Mao, a victory was a victory. The cost didn't matter. Upon hearing of the American withdrawal and casualties, Mao excitedly declared in a telegram to his commanders on December 4th, "This is a great victory." As countless Chinese soldiers perished in the war, Mao Zedong had to justify the heavy losses to the public. Back in 1950, it wasn't easy to stir up hatred towards the US among the Chinese people. In fact, many Chinese held genuine goodwill toward America. Since the 19th century, Americans had built many hospitals and schools in China, and they had helped the Chinese defeat the Japanese invaders during the Second World War. But now, Mao needed to convince the people that America was the most evil and wicked nation in the world. His strategy was very simple: control every aspect of people's lives and restrict the flow of information, cut off their connection with the rest of the world, and brainwash them with propaganda and constant fear. From 1950 to 1953, anyone who didn't follow the official narrative was labeled as American spy or an enemy of the people and persecuted. Their families would become outcasts. Around 2 million so-called counter-revolutionaries, many of whom had worked for the old nationalist government and were pro-America, were executed. Propaganda was everywhere, xenophobia rose, and mass hysteria took over. People started reporting and informing each other just to protect themselves. The party took over businesses in the cities and grabbed full control of food production in the countryside. And when desperate people resisted, they were mercilessly crushed by the People's Liberation Army. In the end, Mao gained complete control over Chinese society. Whether out of fear or just going with the flow, people accepted the official narrative, and hatred of America quickly took root. Mao's hatred for the US wasn't rooted in anything America had done. It was the mere existence of a free country like America that threatened his rule. America, with its deep tradition of freedom, was a living example of what China could become, which terrified Mao. A free society set a dangerous precedent for his people and could undermine his control. And it wasn't just the Americans. Mao even saw the Soviets as a threat. When Khrushchev denounced Stalin under the cult of personality, Mao's disdain for him grew, eventually leading to the Sino-Soviet split. Mao knew that if such ideological reforms reached China, his grip on power would be at risk. Stalinism, with its totalitarian control, was the only path that ensured his survival. After the brutal battle of Chosin Reservoir, both sides were exhausted. By June 1951, ceasefire negotiations began, but Mao wasn't ready to end the war without a grand victory. The fact that the US initiated the ceasefire talks only convinced him that his assessment of Americans was right. They couldn't handle prolonged casualties, and China was on the brink of victory. Why stop now? While President Truman faced pressure from Republicans and international allies, Mao didn't have such concerns. The only person who could stop him was Stalin, and Stalin shared Mao's views. Field Commander Peng Dehuai understood the dire conditions of Chinese soldiers on the front lines and urged Mao to reconsider, but Mao rejected his pleas, assuring Peng that more soldiers would arrive and they would unify the Korean peninsula. The war dragged on for another 2 years. Brutal battles followed, with peace talks repeatedly stalling over the issue of prisoner exchanges. China demanded the repatriation of all POWs to the mainland, while the US insisted on voluntary repatriation. Perhaps this was merely a pretext for Mao to extend the war, or perhaps it was a matter of saving face. Many Chinese prisoners expressed a desire to go to Taiwan, which would have been a significant loss of face for Mao. The conflict continued to claim heavy casualties for all involved except the Soviets. Stalin was happy to supply China with weapons and see the US stuck in an ongoing war. By 1953, even Kim Il-sung had grown weary of the war, realizing reunification was impossible. He just wanted to return to rule his small kingdom. Ironically, by this point, Mao was more committed to unifying Korea than even Kim. Mao needed a victory at any cost. However, with Stalin's death in 1953, everything changed. New Soviet leaders like Beria and Khrushchev saw no point in continuing the war. In combination with President Eisenhower's threat of using nukes, Mao eventually agreed to a ceasefire. The war was finally over. Here, we have to answer the big question: did China win the war? To understand this, we need to consider the price China paid. First, how many Chinese soldiers died? The exact number remains debated, but here we try to give you an estimate. China's official report lists 180,000 military deaths, while US estimates range from 180,000 to 400,000. Soviet's report suggests over 500,000. Here, we dismiss China's official numbers due to the widespread falsification of records. Unlike the US, which carefully documented every fallen soldier, most Chinese troops were buried in unmarked graves without records, and there's even evidence that medical files were deliberately destroyed. The Soviets, as China's ally, though often known for falsifying documents, had no reason to cover up for China, making their figures more reliable. By combining US and Soviet estimates, we believe that over 400,000 Chinese soldiers died. In contrast, the US lost around 37,000 troops, creating a staggering death ratio of nearly 10-1. Aside from the human loss, what other price did China pay? Over 40% of China's GDP was directed toward funding the war, and the country had to be in massive debt to the Soviet Union. Combined with UN-imposed sanctions, China was driven into abject poverty. Worse still, the war led to over 2 decades of international isolation, making China a pariah state. You might think, at least Mao gained the friendship of the Soviets, right? But just 3 years later, in 1956, Mao's relationship with Khrushchev fell apart, eventually leading to the Sino-Soviet split. By 1969, the two nations were so hostile that the Soviets almost nuked China. Or maybe you think China at least earned North Korea's trust. After all, it's thanks to China that the brutal Kim regime still holds firm control over its 26 million people today, keeping them enslaved. But the truth is more complicated. Even before the war, Kim Il-sung didn't trust Mao, and China's influence over North Korea during the war only deepened that resentment. The tension between the two nations has been masked for years by the facade of a strong relationship that continued to this day. So, was it a victory or defeat? That really depends on how you look at it. For the Chinese people, the Korean War was a total disaster. Countless lives lost just to preserve one of the most oppressive dictatorships in the world. But for Mao Zedong and the Communist Party, it was a great victory, a sacrifice entirely worthwhile. The war strengthened Mao's grip on power and made his authority unshakable. And the relentless anti-American and anti-West propaganda that came out of that war still influences Chinese society today and keeps the party's control firmly in place. If you are curious about whether Mao really wanted to join the Korean War, please check out my last video for the full story. Next time, we will dive into the complex relationship between China and North Korea. Even today, Kim Jong-un rules North Korea with an iron fist, keeping millions of people trapped in what is probably the most brutal regime in the world. For the past 70 years, the Kim family's grip on power has only survived thanks to China's unwavering support. But here is a real question. How do China and North Korea truly view each other? Is their friendship as strong as the official narrative claims, or has their relationship always concealed their mutual resentment and mistrust? Stay tuned. See you next time.